敵縮だ。配置につけな。They're slowing down.
We're taking heavy fire. We need support on the left flank immediately.
They are here. Sound the alarm. Prepare defenses now.
Move up. Keep those lines connected. We're almost there. Target sighted 50 meters front. Advanced smoke cover. Acknowledge.
January 17th, 1944. The dense heat of the Pacific sun pressed down on the small Japanese outpost nestled among the jagged ridges of Bougainville. Dust rose in ghostly plumes with every distant rumble. From the ridgelines, the Japanese officers squinted, their eyes catching the glint of steel in the low morning light. A distant roar grew louder, unsettling the familiar cadence of the jungle. Then came the unmistakable clatter of tank treads, low, methodical, relentless. But it was not just the tanks. From their hulls, cables snaked into the undergrowth, connecting to infantry moving in perfect unison. Strange boxes, field phones, clinked with every hand signal, every movement measured and precise. Confusion rippled through the Japanese command post. Never had they seen mechanized forces communicate so seamlessly. Orders were executed before words could reach ears. Tanks and infantry moved as one organism, an integrated machine that seemed almost alive. Fear settled like a heavy fog. The officers exchanged glances, uncertainty reflected in their faces. The reality of modern warfare had arrived, not with a bang, but with the mechanical heartbeat of a coordinated strike. The first shells whined through the canopy, a prelude to chaos, and the officer's worst nightmare was already on the horizon. By early 1944, the Pacific War had reached a critical juncture. The Imperial Japanese Army and Navy were struggling to hold onto territories across the Pacific, from the Philippines to the Solomon Islands. Months of relentless Allied offensives had begun to erode Japanese control over the region. Air superiority, naval blockades, and amphibious assaults had weakened supply lines and isolated forward positions, leaving Japanese forces vulnerable to a new type of attack: well-coordinated, mechanized operations. The American military had learned hard lessons from earlier encounters in the Pacific. Island fighting demanded more than sheer firepower. It required synchronization between infantry, armor, artillery, and air support. On islands like Guadalcanal and New Georgia, Japanese soldiers had demonstrated extraordinary tenacity, but their defensive strategies often relied on static positions, hidden bunkers, and the terrain's natural advantages. They had underestimated the speed at which modern mechanized units could adapt to dense jungles and rough terrain. In response, U.S. commanders began integrating tanks into infantry assaults in ways previously reserved for European battlefields. By equipping tanks with infantry communication systems, field phones that allowed seamless coordination, American units could relay orders instantly, coordinate flanking maneuvers, and react dynamically to enemy movements. Unlike traditional radio systems, which were susceptible to interference or relied on a single operator, these phones allowed every squad to communicate directly with supporting armor. The psychological impact on the Japanese forces was immediate. Commanders accustomed to controlling battle lines through runners and visual signals found their orders delayed or rendered irrelevant. Tanks would advance in perfect rhythm with infantry. Shells would fall precisely on predetermined targets, and ambushes could be preempted before they were fully set. Every advance, every maneuver, seemed preordained, executed with mechanical certainty that defied the Japanese officers' expectations of battlefield chaos. By January 1944, U.S. armored units had reached Bougainville, tasked with clearing Japanese positions to establish airfields for future operations in the Solomon Chain. These operations combined aggressive reconnaissance, artillery support, and infantry tank coordination that relied heavily on the field phone system. Every tank carried at least one line-connected phone, and infantry units were equipped with portable receivers, allowing instant communication across the front. The integration of these systems was not simply a technological improvement. It represented a philosophical shift in how wars were fought, emphasizing speed, coordination, and adaptability over static defense and rigid command hierarchies. Japanese intelligence had intercepted reports of U.S. armored tactics in other theaters, but struggled to interpret their implications. The reports described tanks operating alongside infantry, but the details of coordinated communications were often overlooked or dismissed as exaggeration. Officers arriving at Bougainville were confronted with the reality that these were not isolated incidents. They were the standard operating procedure of the advancing U.S. forces. As the Americans prepared for their assault, Japanese commanders sought to reinforce defensive positions along ridgelines and jungle paths, placing machine guns and artillery in anticipation of conventional attacks. Yet, even their most experienced officers could not predict the speed, precision, and coordination of a force moving with tanks linked to infantry phones. What had once been a manageable defensive challenge now loomed as an existential threat. The stage was set for a confrontation that would challenge the very notions of battlefield command. Japanese officers, trained in traditional warfare and experienced in the brutal jungle campaigns of the Pacific, would soon witness how mechanized communication and combined arms tactics could render even the most entrenched defenses vulnerable. The innovation that truly unnerved Japanese officers on Bougainville was not the tanks themselves, but how they communicated with the infantry. The field phone system was deceptively simple. A network of wires connected the lead tanks to infantry squads, allowing real-time coordination across the battlefield. Each tank carried a telephone set in its hull, and each infantry unit had a portable receiver clipped to their belts. Orders that would have taken minutes, sometimes hours, to relay through runners or signal flags could now be transmitted instantly. In practice, this meant that when a tank commander spotted a Japanese defensive position, he could signal an infantry squad to adjust their advance, lay suppressive fire, or flank the enemy, all without breaking formation or slowing momentum. Infantry, in turn, could call for immediate support from the armor, whether to crush a bunker or provide covering fire. The jungle, previously a shield for the defenders, became a conduit for the U.S. forces' coordinated assault. Japanese soldiers had long relied on observation, camouflage, and fortified positions to slow advancing enemies. But the field phone system disrupted these expectations. Tanks no longer advanced blindly. They moved with purpose, reacting to each minor threat almost before it fully materialized. For Japanese officers, this represented a fundamental shift in combat dynamics. Their experience told them that defenses could hold, reinforcements could arrive, and ambushes could succeed. But these assumptions no longer held true when facing an enemy who communicated as swiftly as they moved. The broader context of the Pacific War also magnified the impact of these tactics. By 1944, Japan was already on the defensive across multiple fronts. Supply lines were stretched, morale was declining, and command structures were increasingly strained. The psychological effect of facing an enemy capable of instantaneous coordination compounded the physical threat. Officers found themselves reacting to situations rather than controlling them. The battlefield had become unpredictable not because of chaos, but because the Americans had rewritten the rules of engagement. Meanwhile, U.S. commanders studied Japanese defensive patterns meticulously. Intelligence reports detailed how officers coordinated artillery strikes and troop movements, and how infantry relied on jungle cover and observation posts. Combining this knowledge with the field phone network allowed U.S. units to anticipate and counter Japanese responses with near-perfect timing. The integration of tanks, infantry, and communication was no accident. It was the product of months of training, field experiments, and battlefield refinement. When the first U.S. tanks rumbled into view on Bougainville, they carried more than armor and firepower. They carried a new philosophy of war. The field phones were an extension of the commanders' minds, allowing them to orchestrate an advance with precision that Japanese officers had never encountered. The unfamiliar clink of the phones, the rapid-fire coordination between units, and the disciplined rhythm of the attack created an eerie sense of inevitability. Even before engagement, Japanese officers began calculating what defenses might hold and what might collapse under such synchronized pressure. But the calculations offered no comfort. Tanks and infantry moved like a single organism, anticipating one another, adapting in real time, and leaving little room for human hesitation or error. The officers' fear was not just for their positions or their soldiers. It was for the very framework of their understanding of combat. The convergence of technology, training, and tactical innovation had created a scenario that was psychologically overwhelming. When battle finally erupted, the Japanese defenders were facing more than firepower. They faced coordination that rendered their experience and expectations obsolete. The stage was now set for confrontation, a clash that would expose the limits of traditional defense and illustrate the power of mechanized, communicative warfare. This understanding of coordination and technological advantage naturally leads into the angles section, where we will examine the human, tactical, technological, and leadership perspectives in greater depth. For the Japanese officers observing the approaching U.S. tanks, fear was immediate and visceral. Years of jungle warfare had honed their instincts, but these instincts offered little guidance against a force moving with mechanical precision. The subtle clatter of infantry phones, almost imperceptible over the roar of engines, created an unsettling rhythm, a rhythm they could not match or disrupt. Officers barked orders, gesturing toward defensive positions, only to see their instructions rendered moot. Tanks moved in concert with infantry, flanking positions before machine guns could be brought to bear. Japanese soldiers, accustomed to ambushes and coordinated defense, found themselves outmaneuvered by invisible lines of communication. Panic, frustration, and disbelief spread through the ranks. One officer later described the moment as watching ghosts anticipate every move we try to make. Fear was compounded by confusion. The battlefield no longer followed predictable patterns, and every misstep could be fatal. The tactical advantage provided by tanks linked with infantry phones cannot be overstated. Previously, infantry and armor often operated in isolation, coordinating through runners or prearranged signals. This method was slow and prone to error. With field phones, U.S. forces executed real-time coordination. Infantry could request immediate support from nearby tanks, adjust positions on the fly, and respond to threats with synchronized fire. At Bougainville, the Americans employed this integration to devastating effect. Tanks led assaults along narrow paths, neutralizing fortifications, while infantry provided cover and adjusted fire patterns based on armored reconnaissance. The Japanese defensive network, which had been meticulously prepared over months, was systematically dismantled. The efficiency of these combined arms maneuvers demonstrated how battlefield communication could be as lethal as the weapons themselves. Field phones were simple in design, yet revolutionary in application. Each tank carried a telephone set wired to infantry units advancing alongside it. Portable receivers allowed soldiers to communicate instantly with armor, relay positions of enemy strongpoints, and call for suppressive fire. This system eliminated the delays inherent in messenger runners, reduced miscommunication, and allowed coordinated maneuvers that seemed impossible under traditional jungle warfare conditions. The psychological effect of this technology was magnified by its stealth. Japanese soldiers could see the tanks, but they could not perceive the network of communication linking every movement. Commands were executed before the enemy fully realized the threat, giving U.S. units a sense of inevitability. For Japanese officers, the field phones transformed each tank into a mobile command post, capable of extending influence across the battlefield with unerring precision. Commanding under fire had always been a challenge, but the introduction of integrated U.S. tactics created unprecedented pressure. Japanese leaders faced a dilemma: adhere to conventional strategies and risk annihilation, or improvise under extreme uncertainty. Some attempted to concentrate fire on tanks first, hoping to break coordination, but the infantry phones ensured rapid adaptation. Officers found that every choice was a gamble. Delays in decision-making could cascade into total collapse, and hesitation was exploited almost immediately by U.S. forces. Leadership was tested not just by enemy fire, but by the mental strain of watching a disciplined, synchronized enemy move as a single entity across the jungle. The fear was compounded by the awareness that the battlefield had fundamentally changed, leaving them scrambling for solutions that often did not exist. The combined effect of human fear, tactical innovation, technological superiority, and leadership strain set the stage for a confrontation that would redefine the nature of engagement in the Pacific. The battlefield had shifted, and the Japanese officers were forced into reactive strategies, unsure how to regain control. Japanese officers quickly realized that conventional counterattacks were largely ineffective. The Americans' combined arms tactics, tanks linked with infantry phones, allowed them to anticipate and react to enemy maneuvers in real time. Attempts to ambush tanks often failed, as infantry units could call for immediate armored support or suppressive fire. Japanese units tried to adapt, shifting positions, laying traps, and concentrating artillery fire, but the speed and precision of U.S. coordination rendered many of these efforts moot. Where once a jungle path or ridge could slow an advance, it now became a conduit for carefully orchestrated maneuvers. Japanese reports from Bougainville describe moments of disbelief. They moved as one. Every time we adjusted, they adjusted faster. Officers faced the disorienting reality that they were no longer dictating the tempo of battle. They were being forced into reactive positions, struggling to predict a coordinated enemy they could not see. The psychological effect on Japanese soldiers and officers was profound. Fear, confusion, and a sense of inevitability permeated defensive positions. Even the most battle-hardened troops, trained for harsh jungle warfare, found their confidence shaken. Observing tanks and infantry advancing with almost preternatural coordination created a sense of futility. Defense seemed pointless, resistance fragile. The presence of infantry phones amplified this effect. Each click, each communicated order, underscored the enemy's organizational superiority. Officers reported that morale declined rapidly during engagements, and soldiers hesitated when faced with decisions that had previously been routine. The fear of being outmaneuvered or surrounded was not abstract. It was immediate, sensory, and overwhelming. The success of U.S. combined arms tactics also hinged on logistical efficiency. Field phones required careful maintenance. Cables had to be laid and protected, and supply lines ensured that both armor and infantry remained operational. This infrastructure allowed sustained, coordinated assaults over multiple days, preventing Japanese forces from regrouping effectively. By contrast, Japanese supply networks were increasingly strained. Reinforcements arrived sporadically, ammunition ran low, and communication lines often relied on runners exposed to enemy fire. The disparity in operational endurance became apparent quickly. The Americans could maintain relentless pressure, while the Japanese struggled to replace even minor losses in personnel or material. The combined effect of tactical superiority and logistical endurance compounded the psychological impact, leaving defenders isolated and demoralized. At a higher level, the presence of tanks integrated with infantry phones forced Japanese commanders to rethink strategy entirely. Traditional defensive doctrines, fortified bunkers, ambush positions, and rigid troop deployments proved insufficient against an opponent who could see, communicate, and strike faster than anticipated. Commanders faced difficult decisions: hold ground and risk annihilation, retreat and cede territory, or attempt unpredictable counterattacks that often failed. The battle on Bougainville became a microcosm of broader strategic challenges faced by Japan across the Pacific. Every engagement revealed the growing gap between Allied technological innovation and Japanese tactical expectations. Officers increasingly recognized that victory required not only bravery and ingenuity, but the ability to adapt rapidly to new forms of warfare. The lessons learned, or rather, the harsh realizations, would shape Japanese decision-making in the subsequent campaigns, often forcing retreat or surrender under pressure they had not encountered in prior years. January 17, 1944. The morning mist over Bougainville's ridges clung to the undergrowth like a shroud, muffling the distant hum of engines. From the Japanese command post, officers strained their eyes toward the advancing U.S. tanks, each vehicle a dark silhouette creeping through the dense foliage. Infantry followed, moving with a rhythm that seemed choreographed, each squad connected to their armored partners by the faint glint of field phone wires stretching across the jungle floor. The first shots rang out around 0800 hours. Japanese machine gunners opened fire from concealed bunkers along the ridge, anticipating that the tanks would hesitate, that infantry would falter under the initial barrage. But the assault did not pause. A tank commander, speaking through the hull-mounted phone, signaled an infantry squad to flank the machine gun nest. Within moments, soldiers moved into position, suppressive fire silencing key defenders before the armor even reached range. At 0832 hours, a secondary U.S. unit encountered a fortified artillery emplacement. The field phone allowed the tank crew to direct suppressive fire from a nearby platoon, while infantry maneuvered to cut off retreat routes. The Japanese gunners scrambled, attempting to realign their fire, but every adjustment had already been anticipated by coordinated movements elsewhere on the battlefield. For officers observing from the ridge, the precision was almost surreal. Orders shouted from the command post could not disrupt the synchronization. Every action seemed countered before it began. By 0900 hours, the Americans had effectively breached the first defensive line. Tanks moved through gaps cut by infantry. Infantry advanced alongside tanks clearing bunkers, and both units communicated continuously via their phone network. The Japanese command scrambled to redeploy forces, but hesitation was costly. A small contingent sent to reinforce a threatened flank was intercepted before reaching the line, and the field phone network ensured the Americans adapted instantly, redirecting units to exploit weaknesses. Amid the chaos, Japanese officers experienced the psychological weight of modern mechanized warfare. Every decision felt delayed, every countermeasure anticipated. Soldiers reported a growing sense of inevitability. No position seemed secure, no counterattack decisive. For the first time on Bougainville, the battlefield felt less like a contested zone and more like a carefully orchestrated operation unfolding with mechanical precision. By mid-morning, at approximately 1030 hours, the Americans had reached a ridge overlooking a key supply path. Tanks provided cover, while infantry advanced to cut off retreating units. Japanese snipers and machine gunners were neutralized systematically. Each action communicated in real time between squads and armored units. The seamless coordination magnified the effect of firepower, amplifying the lethality of each assault. Reports from the Japanese side describe officers moving frantically between observation points, attempting to issue new orders while receiving fragmented updates from runners. The speed of the American advance rendered many attempts futile. It was no longer just a tactical setback. It was the collapse of conventional control. Officers witnessed entire platoons forced into retreat, not because of overwhelming numbers, but because the Americans exploited coordination and communication more effectively than they could respond. By noon, the first phase of the assault had achieved near total domination of the ridge. Casualties mounted, supply lines were disrupted, and the Japanese defensive posture was in disarray. The Americans paused only briefly to consolidate gains, a pause dictated not by caution, but by their ability to maintain constant situational awareness through communication. The field phones ensured that every squad, every tank, knew precisely where support was needed, eliminating uncertainty and preventing the defenders from regaining control. The cumulative effect was devastating. Positions that had been considered strong points were overrun, counterattacks neutralized before execution, and the Japanese command structure strained under the unrelenting pace of coordinated assault. Officers recorded a sense of disbelief, noting that the Americans seemed to operate as a single organism, anticipating moves and countering threats with near-perfect timing. The morning's engagement set the stage for the decisive phase, the final push that would break Japanese resistance on Bougainville and illustrate, unequivocally, the power of tanks integrated with infantry phones. The battlefield had been transformed, and the Japanese officers, for the first time, confronted the reality that their experience and traditional tactics were insufficient against a mechanized, communicative enemy. By early afternoon, January 17th, 1944, the American advance on Bougainville had reached a critical juncture. Japanese defensive lines, once considered nearly impregnable, were collapsing under the relentless pressure of coordinated armor and infantry. From the observation posts, officers could see the full effect of mechanized communication. Tanks and infantry units flowing like water around obstacles, suppressing resistance before it could mount, and exploiting every weakness in real time. At 1,305 hours, a Japanese artillery battery attempted to regroup and target the advancing tanks. A tank commander, speaking through the field phone, immediately relayed coordinates to a nearby infantry squad, which laid down suppressive fire while another tank repositioned to block escape routes. Within minutes, the artillery position was neutralized. Officers recorded that the defenders never fired a coordinated salvo. Every attempt to respond was met with instantaneous counteraction. The psychological strain on Japanese leaders was evident. Many reported feeling paralyzed by the precision of the assault. Simultaneously, infantry squads moved with disciplined efficiency. Soldiers used the jungle's cover to advance, while phone lines kept them in constant communication with armored units. When a bunker attempted to open fire, the nearby tank received the alert instantly, neutralizing the threat before it could inflict casualties. For Japanese troops, the sensation was disorienting. No matter where they repositioned, American forces seemed always one step ahead, guided by a network of silent, invisible lines. By 1400 hours, the Americans had effectively encircled the central ridge, cutting off retreat paths and isolating remaining Japanese units. Commanders attempted to rally forces, but with communication delayed and positions overrun, their efforts were largely symbolic. The field phones had allowed U.S. forces to maintain uninterrupted situational awareness, coordinating movements across a battlefield dense with jungle, cliffs, and entrenched positions. The Japanese command could no longer impose control. They could only react. The intensity of the final push reached its peak at 1,435 hours. Tanks advanced along the last ridge, their movements guided by infantry reporting enemy positions through phone lines. The Americans executed simultaneous flanking maneuvers, suppressing key defensive points and cutting off potential reinforcements. Japanese officers witnessed the systematic unraveling of their battle plans. Positions collapsed one after another, entire squads surrendered, and those attempting to retreat were intercepted. It was a tactical orchestration the defenders could not comprehend, let alone counter. Casualties were mounting rapidly. Japanese records indicate that in less than 6 hours, over half the defending force had been killed, captured, or forced into retreat. Yet the Americans suffered comparatively minimal losses, a testament to the precision enabled by communication and coordination. The psychological impact on Japanese officers was profound. Reports describe a mixture of shock, disbelief, and fear. Many admitted that the effectiveness of the assault had far exceeded their worst expectations. By late afternoon, at 1,600 hours, the battle was effectively decided. U.S. forces had secured the ridge, neutralized artillery and machine gun positions, and disrupted Japanese command structures. The field phone network had ensured continuous coordination, allowing units to exploit every opportunity and respond instantly to unforeseen threats. The battlefield, once fragmented and chaotic, had been reshaped into a controlled, orchestrated theater of war under American command. For the Japanese officers, the defeat was more than tactical. It was existential. The combination of armored assault, integrated communication, and infantry coordination had rendered traditional defensive strategies obsolete. The field phones, small and unassuming, had become symbols of a new era of warfare, one where speed, information, and synchronization outweighed raw numbers or static fortifications. As darkness approached, survivors reported to reorganize and prepare for further attacks. But the lesson of the day was clear. The integration of technology and human coordination had transformed the battlefield. Japanese officers were forced to confront the uncomfortable truth that future engagements would demand adaptation or risk annihilation. The stage was now set for examining the aftermath, the consequences of the battle, its impact on morale, and the strategic lessons learned by both sides. The battle for the ridge on Bougainville left a stark imprint on both sides. By nightfall, U.S. forces had secured their objectives, consolidating positions along key ridge lines and preparing for further advances inland. Reports from the front indicated that Japanese defensive cohesion had been shattered. Entire units were either destroyed or scattered, with officers struggling to maintain command and morale among the survivors. Casualty reports confirmed the disparity. Japanese losses were substantial, with estimates indicating that over half of the defending force was killed, captured, or incapacitated. U.S. forces, benefiting from superior coordination, armor support, and real-time communication, sustained comparatively minimal casualties. These figures alone underscore the effectiveness of integrated operations. Tanks working in tandem with infantry via field phones reduced exposure to enemy fire, minimized delays in responding to threats, and amplified the lethality of every maneuver. For Japanese officers, the psychological consequences were profound. Many reported shock and disbelief at the precision of the assault. Memoirs and field reports describe officers wandering between positions, attempting to issue orders, only to find their commands irrelevant before they could reach their units. The sense of inevitability created by coordinated attacks eroded confidence and led to hesitation among troops, further compounding losses. What might have been manageable defensive setbacks in earlier engagements became catastrophic due to the speed and synchronization of the American advance. The aftermath extended beyond the immediate battlefield. With the ridge secured, U.S. units gained access to critical supply lines and high ground, providing strategic advantage for subsequent operations in the Solomons. Airfields could now be expanded, artillery positions fortified, and reserves deployed to exploit weakened Japanese positions further south. The capture of these areas illustrated the broader significance of communication-integrated mechanized tactics. Not only did they yield tactical victories, but they also created operational momentum, allowing sustained offensive pressure while the enemy struggled to regroup. Japanese forces, already stretched thin across the Pacific, faced the added burden of adjusting defensive doctrine. Commanders recognized that traditional reliance on fixed positions, ambushes, and jungle concealment was increasingly insufficient against an enemy capable of real-time coordination and adaptive maneuvering. The lessons were hard-earned, often internalized only after repeated exposure to these tactics. Reports and communications from surviving Japanese officers reflect this dawning awareness that future battles would require not just bravery, but innovation, flexibility, and rapid adaptation, qualities that were difficult to cultivate under the pressures of ongoing attrition and dwindling resources. The U.S. military, by contrast, validated the investment in training and technology. Field phones, combined with rigorous coordination drills and integrated doctrine, proved decisive in a real-world engagement. The outcome reinforced confidence in combined arms operations and informed tactics in subsequent island campaigns, influencing planning for the Philippines, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. Leaders saw the tangible benefits of linking communication with mobility. It allowed forces to execute complex maneuvers with precision, adapt to unforeseen challenges instantly, and maintain pressure without overextending. The psychological effect on both sides set the tone for subsequent encounters in the Pacific theater. For Japanese officers, the defeat was a warning. The battlefield had fundamentally changed, and failure to recognize and adapt could result in annihilation. For U.S. commanders, it was affirmation that the integration of armor, infantry, and communication technology could overcome entrenched defenses and reduce the uncertainty that had long plagued jungle campaigns. The ridge on Bougainville, once a symbol of Japanese defensive resilience, had become a testament to the transformative power of coordination and innovation in modern warfare. The lessons of the day would echo in the planning rooms, battlefield reports, and personal recollections of soldiers and officers alike, setting the stage for continued evolution of tactics and strategy in the Pacific. In the weeks following the battle, the repercussions of the ridge engagement became increasingly evident across the Japanese command on Bougainville. Officers struggled to restore order among demoralized units, many of which had been fragmented during the coordinated American assault. The effectiveness of tanks integrated with infantry phones had left an indelible mark. Traditional command methods, visual signals, runners, and delayed orders were no longer sufficient to maintain control in dynamic combat situations. Japanese operational planning underwent immediate scrutiny. Commanders recognized that defending positions required more than terrain advantage or fortifications. It demanded anticipation of an enemy capable of instantaneous communication and synchronized movement. Retreats were ordered more cautiously, artillery positions dispersed and camouflaged more meticulously, and supply lines were rerouted to reduce vulnerability. Yet despite these adjustments, the psychological strain on officers persisted. Many reflected in post-battle reports on the paralyzing efficiency of U.S. tactics, noting that even small units, when coordinated, could dismantle entire defensive lines. The long-term effect on morale was equally significant. Soldiers who had witnessed the seamless coordination of tanks and infantry often questioned the effectiveness of their training and leadership. Confidence in traditional defensive strategies waned, and hesitancy became more common in subsequent engagements. This erosion of morale contributed to a broader pattern of retreat and attrition, particularly in isolated islands where Japanese forces were increasingly outnumbered and outgunned. Field reports indicated that some units refused to advance into positions without clear reinforcement, demonstrating a tangible fear instilled by previous encounters with coordinated assaults. From a strategic perspective, the battle underscored a pivotal lesson for the Pacific Campaign. Technological integration and communication could dramatically amplify combat effectiveness. The U.S. success on Bougainville validated combined arms doctrine, highlighting the importance of training, preparation, and real-time coordination. Officers in American units recognized that the principles applied in one engagement could be scaled to future operations, influencing campaigns in the Philippines, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. The integration of armor and infantry communication became standard practice, setting a precedent for modern warfare in the Pacific theater. The psychological advantage extended beyond immediate battlefield success. Japanese intelligence noted the difficulty of predicting American maneuvers when forces were linked by phone networks. The perception of an unstoppable, adaptive opponent had strategic value, often influencing Japanese decision-making before the first shot was fired. Commanders had to allocate troops and resources defensively in anticipation of attacks they could neither foresee nor disrupt effectively. The field phones had not only facilitated tactical success, but had created an operational and psychological edge that shaped enemy behavior across multiple engagements. By the end of January 1944, the battle for Bougainville's ridges had cemented the effectiveness of communication-integrated armor tactics. U.S. forces held the initiative, Japanese officers reassessed their doctrines under pressure, and the evolution of warfare in the Pacific accelerated. The lessons learned here, coordination, adaptability, and technological integration, would reverberate through subsequent campaigns, influencing decisions at the front lines and in strategic command centers alike. The Ridge had become more than a tactical victory. It was a turning point in how war was fought in the Pacific. Japanese officers, confronted with the reality of modern mechanized warfare, were forced to reconcile their experience with the necessity of adaptation, setting the stage for the broader reflection on the significance of communication, technology, and human response in shaping history. The battle on Bougainville, defined by the seamless integration of tanks and infantry phones, marked a profound evolution in the art of warfare. It revealed that victory no longer depended solely on numbers, fortifications, or courage, but on the ability to synchronize men, machines, and information in real time. The small, unassuming field phones, mere boxes of wire and metal, had transformed into instruments of control, amplifying the effectiveness of every soldier, every tank, every tactical decision. For Japanese officers, the experience was both humbling and disorienting. The fear they felt was rooted not in the sheer destructive power of American tanks, but in the certainty of coordination they could not disrupt. Traditional tactics, honed through years of jungle combat and fortified defense, proved insufficient against an enemy that moved with anticipatory precision. The psychological weight of this realization reshaped command decisions, morale, and strategic planning in ways that resonated long after the Ridge fell. From the American perspective, Bougainville demonstrated the tangible benefits of innovation, training, and foresight. By merging technology with doctrine, commanders created a force capable of adaptability, speed, and resilience. The field phones were more than communication tools. They were extensions of command itself, ensuring that intelligence, observation, and orders flowed without delay, giving soldiers and officers alike the confidence to act decisively. Beyond the immediate tactical and strategic outcomes, the engagement serves as a reminder of the human dimension of warfare. Fear, anticipation, and adaptation are as pivotal as firepower. The Japanese officers' terror reflected the clash not only of armies, but of ideas. The confrontation between static, experience-based strategy and dynamic, information-driven coordination. In the broader sweep of history, the battle illustrates the enduring truth that technological innovation, when integrated thoughtfully with human leadership and coordination, can redefine the battlefield. Bougainville stands as a testament to the transformative power of communication, the psychological weight of precise execution, and the inevitability of adaptation in modern warfare. The lessons of that ridge, of fear, coordination, and innovation, echo far beyond the Pacific jungles, offering timeless insights into the nature of conflict and the human spirit that navigates it.